The story of the Clutter family almost feels unreal, as if it were lifted from the pages of a novel rather than real life. A quiet, well-known family in a small Kansas town, their lives appeared orderly, predictable, and untouched by chaos, the kind of setting where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Yet what unfolded was so stark and unsettling that it blurred the line between reality and fiction. That very sense of disbelief is what drew Truman Capote to the case, leading him to write In Cold Blood, a book that presented the Clutter family story with novelistic detail while remaining rooted in real events, forever changing how true stories could be told. On a cold November night in 1959, in the small farming town of Holcomb, Kansas, something happened that would shatter the illusion of safety in rural America forever. The Clutter family went to sleep in their comfortable farmhouse, doors unlocked, as was common in their tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone and crime was virtually unheard of. By morning, all 4 members of the family would be dead, killed in their own home by 2 strangers who had driven over 400 miles across Kansas with murder on their minds. This wasn't a crime of passion or a family dispute gone wrong. This was something far more chilling, something that would haunt America's consciousness for decades to come and inspire one of the most famous true crime books ever written. Herbert Clutter was the kind of man small-town America was built on. At 48 years old, he was a prosperous and respected farmer, the kind of person neighbors looked up to and trusted. He was methodical in his business dealings, preferring to handle everything by check rather than cash, a detail that would prove tragically ironic. His wife Bonnie was 45, and while she had struggled with depression and physical ailments over the years, she was a devoted mother. Their 2 older daughters, Eviana and Beverly, had already moved out and started their own lives. Still living at home were 16-year-old Nancy and 15-year-old Kenyon, 2 teenagers who represented everything good about American youth in the late 1950s. Nancy Clutter was the kind of daughter every parent dreams of having. She was a straight-A student at Holcomb High School, played clarinet in the school band, and was deeply involved in her church and the local 4-H club. She was pretty, outgoing, and genuinely kind, the type of girl who younger kids in the community would seek out for help with cooking, baking, or music lessons. She loved horseback riding, needlepoint, and sewing. She was, by all accounts, simply a lovely person with her whole life ahead of her. Her younger brother Kenyon was 15, a quiet, bespectacled sophomore who enjoyed hunting, woodworking, and tinkering with an old pickup truck his father had let him buy, even though he didn't yet have his driver's license. Like his sister, he was active in 4-H. They were normal kids living normal lives in a place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But 400 miles away, 2 men were making plans that would end those normal lives forever. Richard Hickok, known as Dick, was 28 years old and had recently been paroled from the Kansas State Penitentiary. Perry Edward Smith was 31 and had also just gotten out of prison. These 2 ex-convicts had met behind bars and formed a partnership that would lead to one of the most senseless crimes in American history. The seed of their plan had been planted by a former cellmate of Hickok's named Floyd Wells. She loved horseback riding, needlepoint, and sewing. She was, by all accounts, simply a lovely person with her whole life ahead of her. Her younger brother Kenyon was 15. A quiet, bespectacled Wells had once worked as a farmhand for Herbert Clutter, and during casual prison conversation, he had mentioned to Hickok that Clutter was a wealthy farmer who kept large amounts of cash in a safe at his home. This information was completely false. Clutter didn't have a safe and rarely kept significant cash on hand, preferring to conduct all his business by check. But Hickok didn't know that, and the lie would cost 4 innocent people their lives. Hickok became obsessed with the idea of robbing the Clutter home. He contacted Perry Smith and laid out what he called a cinch, the perfect score. They would drive to the Clutter farm, steal the money from the safe, and then head to Mexico to start new lives. It seemed simple enough in Hickok's mind, but there was a darker element to the plan that he and Smith had already agreed upon. They would leave no witnesses. From the very beginning, murder was part of the equation. These weren't men who were planning a robbery that went wrong. They were planning a massacre. On the evening of November 14th, 1959, Hickok and Smith began their long drive across Kansas. They were armed with a knife and a 12-gauge Savage shotgun. As they drove through the darkness toward Holcomb, the Clutter family was settling in for the night, completely unaware that two killers were heading their way. In the early morning hours of November 15th, Hickok and Smith arrived in Holcomb, located the Clutter home, and found an unlocked door. In that trusting rural community, people didn't lock their doors. The two men walked right in while the family slept. What happened next was methodical and cold-blooded. The killers woke the family and immediately began searching for the safe that didn't exist. They pushed Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon into a second-floor bathroom while they took Herbert to his first-floor office to demand he open the safe. When their search failed and Herbert explained there was no safe, the killers' plan began to unravel. But their commitment to leaving no witnesses remained firm. They retrieved the other family members from the bathroom and began separating them throughout the house. Bonnie's hands were tied in front of her, she was gagged, and then tucked into bed in a second-floor room. Nancy's hands were tied behind her back, and strangely, she was not gagged. She too was tucked into bed. The men then took Herbert and Kenyon down to the basement. In the basement, they first gagged Kenyon and tied his hands behind his back, securing the rope to an overhead steam pipe in the furnace room. Then, perhaps in a bizarre moment of reconsideration or confusion, they cut him free and moved him to an adjoining playroom. They bound and gagged him again and placed him at an angle on a small couch, even stuffing a white pillow behind his head, as if to make him more comfortable before they killed him. It's one of the most disturbing details of the crime, this small gesture of consideration before committing murder. Herbert Clutter was bound and gagged and pushed down onto a mattress box on the concrete floor of the furnace room. Perry Smith stayed with him while Hickok went back upstairs to continue searching for money that wasn't there. When Hickok returned to the basement empty-handed and angry, the two men had a brief debate about what to do next, but they had already made their decision before they ever arrived at the house. Smith, who was known to be unstable and prone to violent outbursts, took out his knife and slit Herbert Clutter's throat. Then he shot him in the head with the shotgun. Moments later, Smith and Hickok entered the playroom where young Kenyon lay bound and gagged on the couch, and Smith shot him to death. They climbed the stairs to the second floor and entered Nancy's room, where Smith shot the 16-year-old girl in the head. Finally, they went to Bonnie's room and shot her in the side of the head. Each victim was killed with a single shotgun blast to the head, except for Herbert, whose throat had been cut first. The killers carefully retrieved each spent shell casing, a detail that shows just how calculated and deliberate their actions were. Later, when recounting the events of that night, Perry Smith would claim that he had stopped Dick Hickok from raping Nancy Clutter. It's impossible to know if this is true, but it adds another layer of horror to an already nightmarish crime. Smith also initially claimed in his oral confession that Hickok had murdered Nancy and Bonnie, but when asked to sign the confession, he refused. According to Truman Capote, who would later write extensively about the case, Smith wanted to take responsibility for all 4 killings because he felt sorry for Hickok's mother, whom he described as a real sweet person. Hickok, for his part, always maintained that Smith had murdered all 4 victims. The truth of who pulled the trigger on which victim may never be fully known, but what is certain is that both men were equally responsible for the massacre. After killing the entire Clutter family, Hickok and Smith fled the scene with their haul from the robbery that had motivated the murders. They took a Zenith portable radio that belonged to Kenyon, a pair of binoculars that belonged to Herbert, and less than $50 in cash, probably left over from a $60 check Herbert had cashed the day before. 4 people were dead for a radio, some binoculars, and about $50. Herbert Clutter's billfold and several items were found scattered in his first-floor bedroom, but no cash was found there. The safe that Floyd Wells had told Hickok about, the safe that had motivated this entire horrific crime, had never existed. 4 innocent people had been slaughtered for nothing. The discovery of the bodies and the investigation that followed sent shockwaves through the community and eventually the entire nation. Approximately 1,000 mourners attended the Clutter family funeral, packing the First Methodist Church in Garden City, Kansas, the county seat located 7 miles east of Holcomb. Most of that enormous crowd also attended the burial at Valley View Cemetery on the north edge of Garden City. The parents' graves are in the center, marked by a double headstone. Nancy's grave and single headstone is just to the left, and Kenyon's is just to the right. The image of that family, torn apart by senseless violence, buried side by side, became a symbol of innocence destroyed. Meanwhile, Hickok and Smith had fled Kansas and were on the run. For 6 weeks they evaded capture, but the Kansas Bureau of Investigation was conducting a dogged and thorough investigation. The break in the case came from Floyd Wells, the former cellmate who had told Hickok about the non-existent safe. Wells came forward with information that led investigators directly to Hickok and Smith. On December 30th, 1959, 6 weeks after the murders, the 2 killers were arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada. They were extradited back to Kansas, where their trial was held at the Finney County Courthouse in Garden City. The trial was straightforward. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and both men had confessed, though they disagreed about who had actually pulled the trigger. On March 29, 1960, both Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death. For the next 5 years, they sat on death row at the Kansas State Prison near Lansing, just north of Kansas City, while their appeals wound through the court system. But ultimately, there would be no reprieve for the men who had murdered the Clutter family in cold blood. On April 14, 1965, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Prison. Hickok was executed first and was pronounced dead at 12:41 in the morning. Smith followed shortly afterward and was pronounced dead at 1:19. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. It couldn't restore the sense of safety that had been shattered in small-town America, and it couldn't erase the questions that lingered about how 2 men could commit such a senseless act of violence against people they had never met, people who had done nothing to them. But the story of the Clutter family murders didn't end with the execution of their killers. Before Hickok and Smith were even captured, a young writer named Truman Capote learned about the murders and became fascinated by the case. Capote was already a successful author, but he saw in this crime something that could become a new form of literature, what he would call a nonfiction novel. He traveled to Kansas with his childhood friend, fellow author Harper Lee, who would later write To Kill a Mockingbird. Together, they interviewed local residents, investigators, and eventually the killers themselves. Capote took thousands of pages of notes and spent 6 years working on the book. When In Cold Blood was finally published in 1966, it became an instant sensation. Capote's detailed, novelistic approach to true crime was revolutionary. He didn't just report the facts, he told a story, getting inside the heads of both the victims and the killers, exploring what led to that terrible night in November 1959. The book was a massive commercial and critical success. As of 2016, it remains the second best-selling true crime book in publishing history, behind only Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter about the Charles Manson murders. In Cold Blood has been adapted multiple times for film and television, ensuring that the story of the Clutter family murders remains in the public consciousness more than 60 years after the crime occurred. The case has been portrayed in a 1967 film where Robert Blake played Perry Smith and Scott Wilson played Richard Hickok. There was a 1996 television miniseries with Eric Roberts as Smith and Anthony Edwards as Hickok. In 2005, the film Capote told the story of Truman Capote's investigation and writing of the book, with Philip Seymour Hoffman winning the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of Capote. The following year, another film called Infamous covered similar ground with Toby Jones as Capote and Daniel Craig as Perry Smith. The story has been examined in documentaries and true crime series, each new generation discovering the horror of what happened in Holcomb, Kansas on that November night. What makes the Clutter family murders so enduringly fascinating and disturbing isn't just the brutality of the crime or the innocence of the victims, it's the randomness of it all. The Clutters weren't targeted because of anything they had done. They weren't involved in criminal activity. They hadn't wronged anyone. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of a lie told by a former farmhand to a fellow prisoner, a lie about a safe full of money that never existed. If Floyd Wells had never mentioned the Clutters to Richard Hickok, if he had talked about a different family or kept his mouth shut entirely, Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter would have woken up on the morning of November 15, 1959, and gone about their normal lives. Nancy would have gone to school, Kenyon would have worked on his truck, Herbert would have tended to his farm, and Bonnie would have been there with them. But because of a casual conversation in a prison cell, 4 lives were ended, and a community was forever changed. The Clutter murders marked a turning point in American consciousness about crime and safety. Before that night, rural America felt insulated from the kind of violence that might happen in big cities. People left their doors unlocked, trusted their neighbors, and believed that bad things happened somewhere else, to someone else. The Clutter's unlocked door, which allowed 2 killers to walk right in, became a symbol of that lost innocence. After the murders, people started locking their doors. They started questioning whether anywhere was truly safe. The crime showed that violence could come from nowhere, could strike anyone, and could destroy lives in the most random and senseless ways. It was a loss of innocence not just for Holcomb, Kansas, but for the entire country. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and be kind to each other.